Center for Emotional Intelligence. And along with my colleague, Dr. Z.J. Ung, we're going to be sharing with you some of the research out of our lab. I just want to say up front that two of our colleagues who are presenting were unable to actually make it here. We've got COVID things, we've got airplane things, we've got new babies. And so we have their presentations recorded and we'll share those with you. And if you have any questions specific to their talks, we may be able to answer them because we do all work in one lab. Otherwise, we will pass those along for you and make sure we can get you connected. So I apologize for that in advance. So I'm going to kick us off talking about the role of creativity in effective cognitive reappraisal among adolescents, along with my co-author, Dr. DeFrance. So I just want to start off by talking about what cognitive reappraisal is. So we're defining it as changing how we think about a situation in order to decrease its emotional impact. So this is the classic example of someone bumps into you and your first thought is what a jerk, but maybe your second thought is, oh, I'm sure they're running late, right? So the way that we think about the situation can change how we're feeling about it. Now we don't want to be creating alternate realities that are false, right? So it's not about tricking ourselves into thinking something that isn't true, but it is often about finding the silver lining after something has happened, about looking for the lessons learned, even in a bad situation you went through, right? So that you can start to change your relationship with the event so that you can feel more pleasant and wanted emotions. So actively and intentionally changing our emotion-related cognitions through this kind of active reappraisal is a hallmark of a lot of our mental health therapies, our cognitive behavioral therapies in particular, and it tends to be associated with greater well-being and psychological health, greater reported optimism along with life satisfaction, and decreases in things like depressed mood. However, and it's a big however, the link between reappraisal and these mental health outcomes is not the frequency with which you attempt to use reappraisal. And there are quite a few studies out there that ask about frequency, right? Is this something you do? How often do you do this? But it doesn't ask anything about the quality of those reappraisal sentences. And so Dr. DeFrance, along with her colleagues, found that among adolescents, that the frequency of use of reappraisal is actually barely related to the perceived success. And so what we want to start to do is move away from quality, or away from quantity of attempting to reappraise, to making sure that those reappraisals are high quality and actually change how we're feeling. So to do that, what we wanted to start to do was look at the characteristics, the kind of sub-strategies within reappraisal that make those reappraisals effective for us feeling the feelings that we want to feel more of the time. Here specifically I'm talking about creativity. I am part of Division 10, which is the Division of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts, and so I have a strong creativity flair to what I do, but I know that this is the education section, so I'm going to explain what I mean by creative real quick. For something to be creative, it has to be both new, novel, original, and effective or useful or appropriate, relevant. If it's just new and original, but not effective or useful or relevant, that's just odd or bizarre, right? Way out there from left field. If it's effective and useful, but not new, that's fine, right? We have our tried and true strategies, but we wouldn't call them creative. So to be creative, you really have to be both of these things. Reappraisal is inherently full of creative potential because we are literally asking you to think about other possible ways to think about something, right? Go beyond your first idea. What else can you generate? And so we're asking people to be creative, right? Think of other effective, but not the obvious ideas for how you might think about this situation. There is some past research, and in that context, it's called reappraisal inventiveness. We're calling it creative reappraisal, but same idea. And people who generate more reappraisals, we're back to frequency for a minute and not quality, but people who generate more reappraisals also tend to be better at other kinds of divergent thinking tasks. So people who are better at how many ways can you use a brick or name all the things that are around also tend to be people who come up with more reappraisals when we tell them come up with more reappraisals. So there is some connection there to the creativity. And then we've also started to look at the unusualness, that originality, that uniqueness of the reappraisals, and found that there is an association between the unusualness, right, not the go-to, it is what it is, but the more original ways of thinking about a situation and its connection to people's self-perceived and others' perceptions of the effectiveness of those reappraisal statements. So we had a little bit to go on here, but again, we wanted to start to dig into what is it that makes those reappraisals effective, and are those things that we could teach to people? That's my end goal. I'm a clinical psychologist. If we can figure out what those things are, we can coach people to create higher quality, more effective reappraisals. So in this study we have a partnership with Prepatech, which is a consortium of high schools in New Mexico. So we had 711 students from 37 of their high schools. In Mexico, secondary school is 3 years. It's the equivalent of our US grades 10 through 12. Our sample was roughly split, identifying as male and female, 15 to 17 years old. These are highly affluent, like the best schools in Mexico, essentially, that prep people to go to some of the best colleges and universities. And so they are high on our SES ladder. And we do not have a race and ethnicity breakdown for you. We were told by the school that the students identify as vastly majority Mexican. But that's who we were working with. We've been partnered with them for about 6 years, doing a number of studies, so this was kind of a piece that we embedded 1 year. We asked them to take our creative reappraisal test that we've been developing over the last few years. It has 4 vignettes. One of them is like, you find out, these are for high school students, right? So you find out that your best friend is moving to another country. The one that induces anxiety, it says, you thought you were giving a 10-minute presentation, and it turns out you have an hour, which I would love, but students don't like, right? You were supposed to go on a date and the person doesn't show up and you're just sitting there, right? And then generate as many creative, positive reappraisals you can think of, and they're given an example, so they really have a sense of what we mean by that. We had 2 raters look through all of their answers on fluency, which is just the number of valid reappraisal sentences. We have, of course, high agreement, and the few disagreements are sorted out through conversation. And then on a 1 to 5 scale, they're rated for their originality. So how unique within this sample, right? Not in the world, but within this sample, you just read all these reappraisals. Is this one that comes up a lot, or one that you haven't, only 1 or 2 people said? And then the effectiveness. Is that a statement that's actually likely to make you feel better, to increase pleasant, wanted feelings? Even though those were in the instructions, you'd be amazed how many we got that were not positive reappraisals. And then we also ran all of the answers through the Loop, which is a linguistic inquiry and word count software. It looks at the numbers of certain, you can tell what words you want it to look for, and it'll tell you what proportion of the answers, of people's answers have those words. And we had 3 things we were curious about. I just realized that I can probably do this. The first was and it's going to be confusing because this was before social distancing meant social distancing, but in the literature, social distancing is the use of other pronouns, right, besides I and we, using you, he, she, they. So as you're reappraising, you're talking about they're probably running late, right, or they got lost, as opposed to like I'm being stood up, okay? So that can be potentially a defense mechanism. We have temporal distancing, which is talking about in the past, or talking about what you're going to do in the future, as opposed to continuing to talk about what is happening in the present tense, which again could be more of a sign of like a rumination, as opposed to what am I going to do about this, right? So I know I'm going to go visit that friend. Now I know what I'm doing on vacation next year. I'm going to visit my friend who moved to England, right? And then finally, tentativeness, which are words like might, could, maybe. How often are those showing up in people's reappraisals, as opposed to definitely, for sure, right? And this can be, we thought, maybe a sign that people are searching. They're trying to come up with alternate ways to think about this, right? We're putting in some effort and intentionality. So those are the things that we have the software check for. We also had all of our students complete the Mesquite, which is a test of emotional intelligence. It's more of a global test of ability. They completed branch 3, which is emotion understanding, which looks at, do people understand kind of the causes of emotions? Are they able to look at their emotional vocabulary and blend words together? So what's the word that means excited and a little bit of anxiety, and the answer is apprehension, right? That kind of thing. And then branch 4, which is emotion regulation, in which they're given vignettes, and then possible regulation strategies, and asked how effective would that strategy be. This gets a sense of people's emotion knowledge, right? But it's knowledge. It's not how they would perform in the moment. And our test is also not quite exactly how you would perform in the moment, but a little closer to actually have to produce something given this vignette. So we wanted to look at how specific reappraisal strategies work above and beyond people's sort of global emotional intelligence knowledge. Here's what we found. So we have kind of our means and standard deviations for our different scores. And then I'll point out that all the way on the right, we checked for gender differences between the males and females in our sample. What we found wasn't super surprising for emotional intelligence. Generally, the females perform better. Sorry guys, so we found that again there in Mexico, at least on that test. And then for reappraisal efficacy, we were not finding a difference. And for originality, we were finding that the male participants were providing more unique or original responses. There was also a difference on how much temporal distancing, with the females using more future-oriented, okay, I will do this kind of a thing. These are the inner correlations, and I'll kind of draw our attention for the sake of time to the top, which is the correlations between the effectiveness of their answers and the other things that we were looking at. So you'll see that the scores on the MSKI, right, the emotion understanding and emotion regulation, knowledge is not playing a very big role here at all. There should be a decimal for the first 0.07. It's not playing a big role here at all, so this is something different. There are significant associations with originality, with social distancing, temporal distancing, and the use of tentative language, although both social distancing and tentative language are negatively associated, which wasn't what we expected. And so anybody who has thoughts on that, I have a discussion section I need to write, and I don't quite know what this means. And finally, because there were those gender splits, we ran a regression where we had step 1 being the emotional intelligence, and then kind of above and beyond that, what are these characteristics of the reappraisals that might be making a difference. We also added in word count here, which in the creativity world we would think of as elaboration, so people who are writing much longer responses. And what we're finding is that there were different patterns between the men and the women. So for the men, we're seeing that originality seems to be making quite a difference, along with actually less use of tentative language. So my original prediction had been that that would indicate some sort of searching for meaning, but it's possible that it's more reassuring to give yourself a certain statement, right? Not they might be running late, but they are in fact running late. And then for our female sample, we see kind of a flip, which is that the temporal distancing was part of what was making a difference. So jumping to that future-oriented, what are we going to do about this, right? So the person's not there, great, well then I am going to go over there and make a new friend. This is a great opportunity to reach out, right? So do something about it instead of sit in it. And again, we're just starting to kind of think through what these things mean. We were not expecting to find gender differences here. And in the creative reappraisal and reappraisal inventiveness literature, there have not been other studies examining the gender differences. So really we're kind of putting this out there as a first, here's what we found, let's see. Of course, our sample is completely in Mexico, so we want to take into consideration things around the culture at this school, and also that all of their answers were in Spanish, and there is a Spanish dictionary for the Luke, so that's what we use, but there may also be idiosyncrasies there that wouldn't show up if we ran this again in the United States or in a country that speaks another language. So that's where we are. So to kind of sum it up, right, the ability to generate effective reappraisals is kind of only mildly associated with that global ability of emotional understanding. So there's something specific here that we might be able to teach above and beyond just knowing someone's high on a test of emotional intelligence. And then overall, the originality does seem to play a role along with that temporal distancing. And then in fact, the social distancing, the putting it on the other people instead of the I and we language seem to be less effective, which may have something to do with sort of blaming or not kind of feeling like you have a locus of control over what you're going to do. We're not quite sure yet. Like I said, this is the first study. And again, that we found those gender differences that we are working through what we're going to make of them. But in the end, I think what we're starting to do is find pieces of things that we can teach people, right? So when we say to our young students or to our clients that we want them to start to try to use more reappraisal, we could start to make some suggestions potentially, right? Don't go with the first reappraisal that pops into your mind. Think of 3 or 4 and then pick the one that's going to help you to feel more pleasant emotions, right? That would be kind of that originality piece. We might purposely say, try to phrase it in the future tense. That's going to make a difference. Try to make sure it has I or we in it instead of she, he, they. And so that's where we'd love to go next with this, is to kind of see that as a bit of an intervention. So with that, I will wrap up. I want to thank my whole Adolescent Initiatives team at the YCEI, and also, of course, Tech and our partners at Technological Momentary that both fund this and allow us to work with their wonderful students. That's it for me. I think for the sake of, what should we do? What do you want to do? Like a question? Do you want to? No. Okay, so maybe we'll, do you want to do questions at the end? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to pull up our next presenter. Maybe. So next we're going to have our Dr. Rachel Baumstreger, who was not able to join us in person, but she has generously recorded her presentation for us. All right, hopefully the sound will work.
Hi, thank you for coming to our presentation. My name is Rachel Baumstreger, and I'm excited to share some of our team's findings about how adolescents regulate their emotions from moment to moment. Before I get started, I'd like to recognize all my team members for their contributions to this project, and I'd like to thank the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative for funding this work. So research shows that emotions matter. Among adolescents, emotions influence how students perform academically, how they relate to other people, and their overall sense of well-being. And an important part of this picture is the extent to which adolescents are able to manage their emotions. Emotion regulation really encompasses anything that someone tries to do to try to control their emotions. This includes efforts to decrease or downregulate unpleasant feelings, like taking deep breaths to calm down if you're angry. Regulation also includes efforts to upregulate, to increase or maintain pleasant feelings. For example, I sometimes make social plans because I expect that it will lead me to feel joyful and connected. And when I have a good time at a concert or a show, I sometimes find myself talking about it on the way home so I can savor or hold on to that good feeling. So it's important to keep in mind that emotion regulation includes all of these types of strategies. Emotion regulation is also complex, and that includes a wide variety of different kinds of steps or actions. So these could be cognitive, includes things like savoring or changing the way you look at something. It also includes behavioral things, so walking away from something or towards something. Most self-report assessments of emotion regulation are global, which means that they ask people to estimate how they regulate it over time. And this is great because it means that measurement can be done relatively quickly. However, it can be problematic because people tend to be biased in how they remember emotional experiences. Specifically, when asked to recall emotions, people tend to overestimate emotions that are similar to their current feelings, that are unpleasant, and that are intense. And if you're more likely to remember some emotions over others, then you also might be more likely to overestimate emotion regulation strategies that go along with those. One strategy for minimizing some of these limitations is to use experience sampling methodology. In ESM, respondents answer surveys in the moment, usually at random times throughout the day or week. This is particularly useful for studying emotional experiences because we know that emotions often vary throughout the day. ESM also allows for the collection of contextual information, which can be particularly valuable for understanding how adolescents regulate their emotions, because we can imagine that their options for regulating are likely to be very different if they're, say, in the classroom versus in the hallway at break. Our team reviewed the literature to identify existing ESM measures of emotion regulation, and we found two things that we wanted to expand on. First, the majority of measures only offered response options related to downregulation. Very few included anything related to upregulation. Second, most studies focused on two specific emotion regulation strategies. First is suppression, which is essentially pushing down your emotions and not dealing with them. And cognitive reappraisal, which is when we think about a situation in a new way. For example, if a member of a group is being very intense about it, to the extent where you might be annoyed, you might step back and reframe to acknowledge, oh, that person really cares about this project and is putting in a lot of effort. So we're interested in building on the existing literature by investigating which emotion regulation strategies adolescents tend to use, but by offering more strategy options and making sure to include options that reflect both upregulation and downregulation. We recruited 36 high school students who downloaded an app to their phones. The app then sent surveys to students 5 times a day that asked them to report how they felt and what they were doing, who they were with, where they were. For each of these surveys, there was also a follow-up survey that asked students to report how they responded to those feelings. And they were given 34 strategies to choose between. All right, so before I go into the regulation results, I want to show you a brief overview of how students were feeling during the 2 weeks when we surveyed them. So in this graph, each line represents how one participant's pleasantness ratings differed across 10 days. We averaged the scores for each person within each day. And even after doing that, the daily feelings really vary, both if you look across participants, so across different lines, and across the 10 days within each person. So each person felt very differently from day to day. We also saw a lot of variation when looking at ratings of unpleasantness, kind of the flip of the previous graph, and for energy levels. So it's important to keep in mind when interpreting the results about emotion regulation that participants are regulating a wide range of emotions. All right, so moving on to the emotion regulation strategies, the most common strategies that were reported by our adolescents included talking to someone in person. And the in-person part is because we also had an option about talking to people online. Listening to music, expressing emotions physically, focusing on the present moment, and working on schoolwork. Now, talking to friends isn't too surprising, given that adolescents tend to be so social. I will say that the music finding surprised me a bit because I didn't have much opportunities to listen to music when I was in high school, but that's really interesting to hear that our adolescents saw it as an important way to regulate their emotions. Now, looking at this list, we became really interested in seeing whether the types of strategies used would depend on how the individual was feeling in the moment. So we compared responses by feeling words, and we found that the top two strategies were consistent across all feelings. So talking to people and listening to music was really popular, regardless of how people were feeling. However, there were some differences in the next most common strategies. So specifically, when adolescents were experiencing pleasant, low arousal feelings, such as feeling calm, they were more likely to focus on the present moment. When they felt unpleasant, low arousal feelings, such as feeling lonely, bored, or tired, they were more likely to think about something else, perhaps to initiate a new feeling. When they experienced higher arousal feelings, regardless of whether those were pleasant or unpleasant, they were more likely to engage in schoolwork, think about the cause of the emotion, or think about the future. Another notable finding from these data were that students reported not doing anything in response to their emotions in approximately 61% of instances. So quite a lot. We also saw this come up in our pilot work, so we included a follow-up question about why they didn't regulate. And the most common responses were that they were okay with the feeling, that it did not occur to them to regulate, or that they did not want to change the feeling. And this last one in particular strikes us as potentially similar to the idea of wanting to maintain a feeling. So this led us to consider, is it possible that at least in some cases, not regulating actually meant that someone was regulating without knowing it? Moss and colleagues have written a lot about this idea of automatic regulation and how it differs from deliberate regulation. An example is that you can imagine getting stuck in traffic. I live in LA, so I encounter this a lot. If I were stuck, I might turn on the radio so I'd feel less bored. And if you ask me what I did to regulate my emotions, I'd be able to label that. However, I might also clench my fists on the steering wheel as a response to feeling frustrated. This type of behaviors happens so quickly that I might not even be aware of it. Therefore, it's important to consider that self-reports of emotion regulation may miss these instances of automatic regulation. Given that no regulation was such a common response in our study, we think that looking more into this idea of automatic regulation could be a really interesting direction for future research. In addition, it'd be extremely useful to replicate this study with a larger and more diverse sample. Doing this would allow for comparisons of emotion regulation across contexts. So we could compare, for example, how adolescents tend to regulate when they're alone versus with their friends versus with acquaintances. This study was done as a part of a larger project aimed at creating what we call the Momentary Emotion Assessment. This is an app that we developed with the help of Waverly softwares that can be used to assess how adolescents feel and how they regulate their feelings throughout the school day. It also provides individualized reports to students right within the app. If you'd like to know more about this tool, I listed a website where you can read a project description and also explore other research going on at the Deal Center for Emotional Intelligence. And of course, if you have any questions about this presentation, please don't hesitate to contact me. My email is rbaumsteiger@cpp.edu. All right, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to hearing any questions or comments you all have. Hi, thank you for...
I realize that I have to plug in the computer or we will make it. And next we have CJ. Take it away.
Hi everyone, my name is ZJ. I go by my initials. I'm here to introduce to you the Student Emotion Regulation Assessment, which we call SARA. And this is developed by Yale Center of Emotional Intelligence, and it is funded by CZI. So the Student Emotion Regulation Assessment is developed specifically for use in schools. And why did we do that? Because there has been a rapid growth and adoption of social and emotional learning programs in schools. And most of these programs, the explicit target area of focus is emotion regulation. However, there's not a lot of outcome measures available for use in schools. There's a lot of emotion regulation assessments used in research, but they're not often used in schools. And there are two main reasons. One is feasibility issues, the cost, how long it takes to administer, whether they provide automatic data reports. Another reason is actionability. So research, we are filled with raw data, means, R-squared, standard deviation, but what does this mean to our students? What does this mean to our educators? So how do we translate raw data into meaningful information? And this will be what my presentation will be focusing on. And so I just want to give you a brief snapshot of what the SARA looked like. The SARA has two versions. Today we'll be focusing on the secondary version, which is for students in grades 6 through 12. So SARA is a vignette-based assessment. It follows a situational judgment task format, whereby students are presented with a vignette of an emotional situation that commonly occurs in schools. And we created this vignettes based on input from students themselves. And so these vignettes are showed in 3 different panels. So the first panel basically set the scene, the second panel talks about the problem, and the third panel states the emotion. So the vignettes capture different emotions, specifically anger, sadness, anxiety, and boredom. And then after they were presented with the vignette, we asked them to indicate what they would do. And we provided some options. So the options are different emotion regulation strategies. The SARA tapped into 8 different emotion regulation strategies. So for example, the first one is try a different study technique, like using flashcards to help you better remember the material for test anxiety. That is more of a problem solving. Talk with a friend or a parent about how anxious you feel. It's more of emotional support. Focus on something else. It's more distraction. And then keep worrying about how you're going to do it on the test tomorrow. Is more of rumination. So something special about the SARA S is that we provide individual student data reports to the students themselves so that they can learn from the data to provide meaningful, actionable information to them. So this is our first version of the data report. We're in the midst of revising it based on our focus group discussion and feedback that we got from the students. But the main thing that the SARA provides is the emotion regulation strategy profile. Now, why is this really helpful and important? It's because the current emotion regulation research, we are really trying to go away from oh, this strategy is a one-size-fits-all. Reappraisal is the best. It works for everyone in every single situation. And we know that that's not true. There's no strategy that is universally helpful or harmful for anyone in every situation. So we are trying to basically show students that it's best to build a wide repertoire of strategies. And whenever the situation comes, or depending on how you feel at that point of the day, try to pick one strategy out of your toolbox. And for each strategy, we also provide like the pros and cons as well as suggestions on how they could better regulate their emotions. We also provide like reflection questions like, does the profile seem accurate to you? What other strategies can you use? If there's a strategies that you over rely on, what other strategies can you use to add into your toolbox? And if something that you use very often, is it actually helpful for you? Or maybe it's actually not that helpful and maybe you should use something else instead. And so the data I'll be presenting on is like our student focus groups that is conducted with online with 38 students across 5 different schools. And we really wanted to focus on the helpfulness and the actionability of the data reports, the student data reports. So we focus on the intellectuality, the ease of understanding, the utility, the helpfulness, as also the question of like whether they're willing to share their individual report with the educators. Because right now the student reports are individual, only adolescents have access to them. The schools only have aggregated data reports that's across like grade level or classroom level. So one of our questions was, how easy was it to understand the information in the report? And over 80% of the students said that it's somewhat easy or very easy to understand. However, some feedback they gave was, there were some like wording that were like, the language could be like further simplified. For example, like we use the word reappraisal, but students doesn't know what reappraisal or rumination is, so they prefer words like reframing of a rumination, like repeated thinking or repetitive thinking. So they wanted like simplified language. They also wanted more like concrete examples to show them what rumination or reappraisal is like in school settings. And also we asked about the utility. How useful do you think was it for you to know your emotional regulation strategy profile? And again, over 80% of them said that it was fairly or very useful. And a lot of them found it useful because it prompted like self-reflection. Because it like when they saw their profile, they were like, oh, actually like, you know, I think I react this way, but yes, I actually do react this way, or no, I actually do not react in this way, and maybe I should try something else. And I think it's shown even more like, for example, this student above, they usually feel that they do a lot of avoidance, and then they realize that, oh, I actually do some reappraisal. And there's often other situations whereby like, oh, I actually do a lot of avoidance and escape, but I didn't realize it until like I look at this data report. So it prompted a lot of like self-reflection and thinking about what they do on a day-to-day basis. And we also asked about how helpful were the suggestions, not just the strategy profile, but also the suggestions itself. And again, over 80% said that they were fairly or very helpful. And it was helpful for them to see that, oh, there's multiple strategies. There's not just one. We don't always have to use relaxation or like controlled breathing. We can always use like other strategies. However, one thing that they mentioned that it's often hard for them to remember to use these strategies in the heat of the moment. And that indicates that they really need a lot of support and practice from educators as well as in schools. And now, for me, the interesting question of whether they're willing to share their individual reports with either educators or school mental health professionals. So overall, like about 40% of our students actually said that they are very uncomfortable or somewhat uncomfortable sharing their individual data reports with adults at school. They're actually less comfortable sharing it with teachers, as you can see, as compared to school mental health professionals. And one of the major reasons is because they feel that teachers are not equipped to provide them with social and emotional support. That's not their expertise. Their expertise is more academic. And also, but one major factor across like both groups of adults is that there is the lack of like rapport, lack of trust. And what they prefer is for them to pick and choose whom they could share the reports with. And even though we conducted this focus group over the pandemic, we did ask them that would it be more comfortable for them when they return to like in-person learning? Would they be more comfortable? And their answer remains to be no. Because they say that even when they go in person, they only see each teacher like 1 hour a day. There isn't really time to get to know a teacher, so there's still no trust, no relationship with that teacher or that adult. So in other words, there needs to be more work done in the school settings in terms of improving student and teacher relationships. And this is some like quotes that we got from students. As you can see, like there's a lot of emphasis on trust and the fear that if the teacher have their information, they might prejudice how they view their students. And this is the end of my presentation, and if you have any other questions about Sarah, please feel free to ask me. And I'm going to move on to our presenter.
All right, thank you, Vijay.
Everyone, thank you so much for coming to my talk today. I'm going to be talking about the importance of understanding the role of context in adolescent emotion regulation. So just so we're on the same page, emotion regulation involves the ways that individuals influence which emotions they have, when these emotions occur, and how they are experienced and expressed. So for example, toning down your frustration if a partner does something that bothers you, or trying to be less sad if you realize you've lost something that you cherish. And there are many, many components of emotion regulation. I would argue that two of the most commonly studied are, first of all, what do you do to regulate your emotions? And second, how well do you regulate your emotions? And to map onto the research literature, these two components translate to strategy use and regulatory success. So the specific strategies you're using and how successful you are. And just for the purpose of today's talk, I want to be clear that I'm talking about perceived success. There are many ways to look at this. My research looks at perceptions of success. So it's important to note that the majority of the research that has been done on these two really important components of emotion regulation relies specifically and really exclusively on trait-based estimates. So we are assuming that the strategies individuals use and how successful they are is a trait that is consistent across situations of time. So how often do you tend to use a specific strategy? In general, when you regulate, how successful are you? These are the questions we tend to ask people. And these have this underlying assumption that our strategy use and our regulatory success are, again, this a trait-like quality we have that are not reflections of our different emotional situations. So in other words, they're not changing across emotional situations. But our emotions don't happen in a vacuum. If we think about a student feeling sadness, feeling upset at school, there are many situations that could be eliciting this emotional reaction. Just one of which could be some kind of social conflict or being bullied. So our emotions are a reflection of the unique situational factors that surround us, and our regulatory efforts likely function differently depending on these situations. And perhaps most importantly, our efforts to encourage successful regulation in any context, including education, educational institutions, must be sensitive to these situational factors. So to be clear, there are a lot of different situational factors that could influence us. I'm going to be focusing on these specific three because the literature has tended to focus on these specific three. So the first factor that might influence your strategy use and your success would be the specific emotion, discrete emotion. So what emotion are you feeling? Or what emotion are you regulating? Second would be emotion intensity. Are you feeling a very small level of emotion or a big emotion? And perceived situational control. Do you feel like you have a lot of control over the situation, or do you feel that it's completely beyond your control? And these situational factors might influence our strategy use. So individuals might use different strategies depending on what emotion they're feeling, how intense it is, how much control they perceive to have. They also might influence how successful we are at regulating our emotions. So some emotions just might be easier for us to regulate than others. Higher intensity emotions are likely harder to regulate than lower intensity emotions, and emotions might be easier to regulate if we perceive we have high levels of control over the situation. But third, and this is something I'm particularly interested in, is that these situational factors might also influence the association between strategy use and success. So just as an example, some evidence shows that reappraisal, which is very commonly thought of as a particularly beneficial strategy, might actually only be successful when individuals are regulating low control situations. So the specific emotions we're experiencing, their intensity, as well as controllability, might be contributing to the likelihood that any specific strategy would be successful. So what do we know so far? Well, what we know is that assessments of context in emotion regulation are pretty rare. They're becoming a bit more common as the rise of cell phone apps is increasing. But they're still very uncommon, and it's particularly uncommon to see assessments of context among non-clinical adolescent populations. And I argue this is quite problematic because adolescents are in the process of developing regulatory habits that might last well into adulthood and that could create vulnerabilities for mental health difficulties. So it's important that we understand why and how adolescents are regulating their emotions during real-world emotional events. So I developed with my PhD supervisor, Tom Hollenstein, we developed the current study to answer 3 specific questions. Which situational factors are associated with strategy use in adolescents? Which situational factors are associated with success? And that third point that I mentioned, which situational factors are moderating the association between strategy use and success? I'm happy to answer any questions about methods. The main thing you need to know is that we had a relatively large, about 178 adolescents in our sample. They were a community sample, about 13 to 15 years old, and we had them fill out an ESM app. They completed 3 prompts per day for 2 weeks. If you have any questions about ESM or the app we used, I would be more than happy to talk to you about this. Feel free to email me or speak to me during the symposium. So the ESM app that we use, we developed to answer some really specific questions. So one was, what is the base emotion you've experienced since the last prompt? When you first noticed your emotions, how intense were they? How much control did you have? That's a type of, let's just say, how much control did you feel that you had over the situation? What did you do in response to your emotions? That was tapping into strategy. We gave them the different strategy options. And then finally, overall, how successful do you think you were in managing your emotion? And just as a spoiler alert, there were other questions in the app. These are just the ones that map on to what I'm going to be talking about today. So specific strategies we looked at, these come from the Regulation Emotion Systems Survey, a survey that I developed a few years ago. If you have any questions about why these specific strategies, please again feel free to reach out. But we measured distraction, reappraisal, rumination, relaxation, suppression, and engagement. So just for any of the data analysis people in the crowd, we use multi-level modeling, of course, because we had nested data. So we have prompt level data nested within person. So at the between level, we looked at age and gender on each of these questions. The main thing to note is that there really weren't any age and gender, spoiler alert, there weren't really any age and gender effects. So this is something that's quite consistent across the relatively small age range of our sample and across male and female participants. So really quickly, there's some brief variable prep that is important for any kind of experience sampling analyses. So for each strategy, we created a dichotomous variable that represented, whether that strategy was selected or not. So reappraisal, yes or no. And for emotion, we dichotomized anxiety, yes, no, sadness, yes, no, anger, yes, no. Those were the options that participants were given. We did have a prep session where we walked through all of these different questions that are going to be presented with. We talked about the different options and how they could consider them. So there is a degrees of freedom limitation when using emotions like this. So for the current analysis, we only use anxiety or sadness. We didn't have this issue with strategy because they were allowed to select more than one strategy. So just for emotion, it's important to know that they only, in the analysis, we're only using anxiety and sadness. Okay, so research question number 1. Our dependent variable strategies was a yes or no, and we ran a model for each strategy. So we're looking at whether sadness, anxiety, intensity, and controllability mapped onto each strategy use, the proportion that someone was, the likelihood that someone would use that strategy within a prompt. And what we find is that students or participants were more likely to use distraction, reappraisal, and suppression when they were regulating sadness, less likely to use relaxation or engagement, and more likely to use distraction, reappraisal, relaxation in managing anxiety, less likely to use engagement. Higher intensity emotions were more likely to be regulated with rumination, relaxation, and engagement, less likely to be regulated with distraction. And surprisingly, there was no association between controllability and any of the strategies that we measured, but I'm going to come back, keep this in your mind, because I'm going to come back to this in a minute. So research question number 2, so our dependent variable is just success, that it was about, I think it was a 1 to 10 scale, how successful do you feel you were in managing that emotion? Again, perceived success, pros and cons of taking this approach. And again, our independent variables, anxiety, sadness, intensity, and controllability. So what we find, higher levels of success are associated with anxiety and with controllability. Lower levels of success associated with intensity. So more intense emotions, just like we would anticipate, but surprisingly rare to find in the literature, actual evidence of this. Lower levels of success were found for higher intensity emotions. And finally, research question number 3. So which situational factors are moderating the association between strategy use and success? So our dependent variable is success, and our independent variable is this moderation between strategy use and situational factors. And because we have quite a few of these combinations, all of our strategies and each of the situational factors, we used a moderate or a more conservative p-value, so it's small, anything smaller than 0.01 we considered significant. So just as an example, a question that maps onto this, these types of analyses would be, does the association between reappraisal use and success change depending on the level of intensity? And so, as I mentioned, we're coming back to the situational control piece. This is where situational control seems to play a more significant role. What we find is that situational control moderated the association between reappraisal and success, as well as engagement and success. So situational control might not be playing a direct role on strategy use, but what we see is that reappraisal seems to be quite more, significantly more effective than not using reappraisal in low situational control situations. But there does not seem to be a difference at all between reappraisal use or not reappraisal use when situational control is quite high.
And thank you so much for coming.